Leonard Baskin had knocked on thousands of doors in his career, but nothing prepared him for what he would find inside a modest split-level house on Maple Drive that cold November afternoon in 1959. A missing screw on a vacuum cleaner, barely noticeable to anyone else, caught his trained eye. That tiny detail would unravel an entire Soviet espionage network operating right under America's nose, using the most ordinary household items to transport the nation's deepest secrets. What began as a simple sales call would thrust an unremarkable man into the shadows of the Cold War, where courage meant trusting your instincts, even when everything seemed perfectly normal. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning had started like any other Tuesday for Leonard Baskin. He sat in his 1956 Plymouth Savoy outside a diner on Route 22 in Northern Virginia, reviewing his sales territory map with a lukewarm cup of coffee balanced on the dashboard. The leather briefcase beside him contained product catalogs, order forms, and the tools of his trade, arranged with the precision of a man who had been doing this work for nearly 15 years. At 42 years old, Leonard had learned to read neighborhoods the way a fisherman reads water, understanding which streets held promise and which ones would waste his time and shoe leather. The houses on Maple Drive represented middle management prosperity, the kind of families who could afford a top-of-the-line vacuum cleaner if he presented it correctly. Leonard adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror, practiced his smile, and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. Fallen leaves crunched under his polished shoes as he walked up the concrete path to the first house, his demonstration vacuum rolling smoothly behind him. The weight of the machine had become so familiar over the years that he barely noticed it anymore, just an extension of himself. Mrs. Helen Morozov answered the door on the third knock. She was a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a green cardigan over a simple dress. Her accent carried just the faintest trace of Eastern Europe, softened by what Leonard guessed was at least a decade in America. She had that careful politeness of someone who had learned English as a second language and wanted to use it correctly. "Good morning, ma'am. My name is Leonard Baskin, and I represent Superior Home Products. I'm in your neighborhood today offering a free demonstration of the most advanced vacuum cleaning system available to American families," Leonard said, delivering his opening pitch with practiced ease. "It will only take 15 minutes of your time, and I promise you'll be amazed at what this machine can do." Helen hesitated in the doorway, her hand still on the frame. "I already have a vacuum cleaner," she said. "It works fine." Leonard had heard this objection 10,000 times. "I'm sure it does, ma'am, but may I ask, when was the last time you saw what your current vacuum actually picks up?" Most people are shocked when they learn how much dirt and dust gets left behind. He smiled warmly. "That's why I'm offering this free demonstration. No obligation to buy anything. I'll even clean one room for you completely free of charge." Something in her expression shifted, a calculation happening behind her eyes. Leonard recognized that look too. The moment when curiosity or practical thinking won out over the desire to close the door. "Just 15 minutes?" she asked. 15 minutes. I'll set a timer if you'd like." She stepped back and opened the door wider. "All right, you can come in." The interior of the Morozov home was impeccably clean, furnished with the modern sensibility of the late 1950s. A television set occupied one corner of the living room, its screen reflecting the morning light from the windows. Photographs on the mantelpiece showed Helen and a serious-looking man Leonard assumed was her husband, along with what appeared to be family members from an older generation. Everything had its place, from the magazines aligned on the coffee table to the coasters positioned precisely beside the armchairs. Leonard began his demonstration, explaining the superior suction power and the revolutionary filtration system while he worked across the beige carpet. He made conversation as he always did, learning that Helen's husband worked for a government contractor, that they had no children yet but hoped to start a family soon, that she had come to America from Czechoslovakia in 1948, just after the communist coup. She relaxed as they talked, the natural wariness fading as Leonard proved himself to be nothing more than what he appeared, a salesman who was good at his job and genuinely believed in his product. "Now, let me show you something that really sets this model apart," Leonard said, crouching down beside his demonstration unit. "The motor housing has this innovative design that allows for easier maintenance." He pointed to various features, his hands moving with the confidence of repetition. "Most vacuum cleaners, you have to take them to a repair shop if anything goes wrong. But with this model, a homeowner can handle basic maintenance themselves." It was at that moment that Helen mentioned she might need some maintenance on her current vacuum. "It has been making a strange noise lately," she said, high-pitched, like something is loose. "Would you like me to take a look? Part of my service to potential customers." She disappeared into a hallway closet and returned with her vacuum cleaner. Leonard recognized it immediately as a model from a competitor. But what caught his attention was that it had been modified. The housing showed signs of customization, with additional screws in places where the manufacturer wouldn't have placed them. As a man who had spent 15 years working with these machines, Leonard could spot alterations instantly. "This is interesting," he said, keeping his voice casual. "Looks like someone did some custom work on this unit." "My husband had a friend who works with machines," Helen said quickly. "He made some modifications to improve the suction." Leonard nodded, examining the vacuum more closely. The modifications were professional, far beyond what a hobbyist would attempt. But what really caught his trained eye was a missing screw on one of the custom access panels, a panel that shouldn't exist on a standard model. The hole where the screw belonged showed fresh metal, suggesting the screw had only recently been removed or lost. "This modification work is quite sophisticated," Leonard said, running his finger along the seam of the panel. "Mind if I open this up? That noise you mentioned might be coming from here." Helen's demeanor changed subtly. The relaxation evaporated, replaced by something harder to define. "Actually, I think I should wait for my husband to come home before anyone opens it up. He's particular about his things." Of course, Leonard said, backing off immediately. "I completely understand." He stood up, brushing off his slacks. "Tell you what, I'll leave my card. If you'd like me to come back when your husband is home, I'd be happy to take another look. No charge for the consultation." The rest of the visit proceeded normally, but Leonard's mind kept returning to that missing screw and the custom panel. Something about the situation felt wrong, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. Helen declined to purchase his vacuum cleaner, which didn't surprise him. She seemed eager for him to leave, checking the clock on the wall twice in the final 5 minutes of his visit. As Leonard loaded his demonstration unit back into his Plymouth, he sat for a moment before starting the engine. He had developed strong instincts over the years, a sense for when people were hiding something. Usually it was financial trouble or marital problems, nothing that concerned him. But this felt different. The modifications to that vacuum cleaner were too professional, too deliberate, and that missing screw nagged at him like a splinter under the skin. He drove to his next appointment, but throughout the day, his mind kept circling back to the Morozov house. By the time he returned home that evening to his small apartment in Arlington, Leonard had made a decision. He would find a reason to go back. The opportunity came 3 days later. Leonard called the Morozov residence mid-morning when he calculated that the husband would likely be at work. Helen answered, her voice cautious when she recognized his name. "Mrs. Morozov, this is Leonard Baskin from Superior Home Products. I hope I'm not bothering you, but I was reviewing my notes from our meeting, and I realized I left one of my demonstration attachments at your house. Would it be possible for me to stop by and retrieve it?" It was a lie, of course. All of Leonard's equipment was accounted for, but the lie gave him a plausible reason to return, and Helen, after a pause, agreed that he could come by in an hour. When Leonard arrived, he brought his toolbox along with his sales case. "I thought while I was here, if you're still hearing that noise from your vacuum, I could take a quick look," he said as Helen opened the door. "No charge, of course, just good customer service, whether you buy from me or not." Helen seemed torn, but practical considerations won out. The vacuum had been making even more noise, she admitted. Her husband had been too busy with work to look at it, and she worried it might break down entirely. "I suppose it couldn't hurt," she said finally, "but I can only give you a few minutes. I have an appointment this afternoon." Leonard worked efficiently, taking apart the outer casing of the vacuum cleaner with practiced movements. The custom modifications became even more apparent with the housing removed. Someone with significant technical skill had created a false compartment within the body of the machine, carefully hidden behind the original motor housing. The missing screw belonged to a small access panel on this hidden compartment. "That's remarkable engineering," Leonard said, keeping his tone admiring rather than suspicious. "Whoever did this really knew their way around machinery." "Can you fix the noise?" Helen asked, tension clear in her voice. "Let me just check this section here," Leonard said, reaching toward the access panel with the missing screw. His fingers found the edge and began to work it loose. "Don't touch that," Helen said sharply. "That part doesn't need to be opened." Leonard pulled his hand back, but not before he glimpsed something that made his pulse quicken. Through the gap left by the missing screw, he could see what appeared to be a small metal cylinder inside the false compartment, the kind used to protect film from light and moisture. "My apologies," Leonard said, maintaining his pleasant salesman demeanor even as his mind raced. "The noise seems to be coming from the main motor bearing. I can tighten it up, should help with the sound." He worked for another few minutes, actually making some legitimate adjustments to reduce the noise, all while his thoughts spun through possibilities. A hidden compartment, a film canister, A woman with a Czech background whose husband worked for a government contractor. The year was 1959, and the Cold War dominated the newspapers every day. Soviet spies had been discovered in America before. Names like the Rosenbergs still fresh in public memory. Leonard finished the repair and packed up his tools. "That should take care of the noise," he said. "If it starts up again, you really should have it looked at by someone who knows the custom work that was done." "Thank you," Helen said, already moving toward the door to show him out. "I appreciate your help." As Leonard drove away from the Morozov house for the second time, he gripped the steering wheel tightly. He was just a vacuum salesman, a man who made his living going door to door in suburban neighborhoods. What he suspected, what he thought he had seen, was the stuff of spy novels and government investigations. He could be completely wrong. The film canister might contain family photographs or personal documents. The modifications might be exactly what Helen claimed, improvements made by a mechanically inclined friend. But Leonard Baskin had not survived 15 years in sales by ignoring his instincts, and his instincts were screaming at him that something was very wrong in that neat, clean house on Maple Drive. That evening, Leonard sat in his apartment with a glass of whiskey he barely touched. Considering his options, he could do nothing, forget what he'd seen, and go back to his normal routine of sales calls and commission checks. He could confront the Morozovs directly, though that seemed both dangerous and pointless. Or he could do what increasingly felt like his duty as an American citizen during these tense Cold War years. He could call the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The thought made him uncomfortable. Leonard had never been the type to get involved in matters beyond his immediate concerns. He paid his taxes, voted in elections, and generally believed in minding his own business. But the memory of that film canister in its hidden compartment, combined with the careful modifications and Helen's defensive reaction, pushed him toward action. The next morning, Leonard found himself in the lobby of the FBI's Washington field office, feeling profoundly out of place among the serious men in dark suits moving purposefully through the corridors. He had called ahead, been transferred 3 times, and finally spoken to someone who agreed to see him. Special Agent Douglas Pritchard met him in a sparse interview room on the 3rd floor. Pritchard was younger than Leonard expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with the clean-cut appearance and alert eyes of someone trained to spot deception. He listened without interrupting as Leonard explained what he had seen, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When Leonard finished, Pritchard leaned back in his chair and studied him carefully. "Mr. Baskin, you understand that what you're suggesting is a serious accusation," Pritchard said. "Espionage carries severe penalties, and we can't investigate every suspicious modification to a household appliance." "I understand that, Agent Pritchard, but I've been working with vacuum cleaners for 15 years. I know what normal modifications look like, and this wasn't normal. The compartment was designed to hide something, and I saw what looked like a film canister inside." "Did you actually see the film? Or just the canister?" "Just the canister." Mrs. Morozov stopped me before I could open the panel. Pritchard tapped his pen against his pad. "Tell me again about Mr. Morozov's employment." "Helen said he works for a government contractor. She didn't specify which one or what he does." "And Mrs. Morozov's background?" "She came from Czechoslovakia in 1948. Her accent suggests she learned English later in life, but she speaks it well." Pritchard made more notes, then looked up at Leonard. "I'm going to be straight with you, Mr. Baskin. We get tips like this regularly. Most of them turn out to be misunderstandings or overactive imaginations, especially these days when everyone's worried about reds under the bed. But we investigate them all, because occasionally, one of them is real." He closed his notebook. "We'll look into the Morozovs. In the meantime, I need you to stay away from that house and not discuss this conversation with anyone. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir. If we need you for anything else, we'll be in touch. Thank you for coming forward." Leonard left the FBI building feeling anticlimactic. He had expected more urgency, more immediate action. Instead, he had been thanked and dismissed, left to wonder if anything would come of his report at all. He returned to his sales route, knocking on doors and demonstrating vacuum cleaners, trying to push the entire incident from his mind. 3 weeks passed. Leonard had almost convinced himself that the FBI had investigated and found nothing, that he had been mistaken about what he saw. Then, on a Wednesday morning in early December, Special Agent Pritchard called him at home. "Mr. Baskin, we need to talk. Can you come to the field office this afternoon, say around 3 o'clock? The tone suggested this wasn't a request. Leonard rearranged his appointments and arrived at the FBI building promptly at 3. This time, Pritchard met him in a different room, one with maps on the walls and several other agents present. A senior agent introduced as Robert Cordell, a man in his 50s with gray temples and the bearing of someone who had seen everything, gestured for Leonard to sit. "Mr. Baskin, your information checked out," Cordell said without preamble. We've been conducting surveillance on the Morozov residence for the past 2 weeks. What we've observed corroborates your suspicions and has opened up something significantly larger than a single suspicious vacuum cleaner. Leonard felt his mouth go dry. What did you find? Pritchard spread several black and white photographs on the table. They showed Helen Morozov leaving her house, entering a shopping center, meeting briefly with other individuals. Mrs. Morozov has been making regular trips to various locations around the D.C. area. She follows counter-surveillance protocols, things that an innocent housewife would have no reason to know or practice. We've identified several individuals she's made contact with, all of whom have connections to known Soviet intelligence networks. So she is a spy? Leonard asked. We believe she's a courier, Cordell said. Her husband, Malcolm Morozov, works for Hartwell Defense Systems, a contractor that handles classified Pentagon documents. We've confirmed that documents matching ones from his facility have been showing up in Soviet hands. We suspected there was a leak but couldn't identify the method of transfer. Your vacuum cleaner appears to be the answer. Pritchard pointed to one of the photographs. The vacuum cleaner gets modified by Malcolm Morozov to include the hidden compartment. He places microfilm of classified documents inside. Helen then uses her shopping trips and social calls as cover to pass the vacuum to another courier who extracts the film and passes it up the chain. Eventually it reaches a Soviet handler who gets it out of the country. But why a vacuum cleaner? Leonard asked. Seems elaborate. That's precisely what makes it clever, Cordell explained. It's a household item that can be transported openly. If Helen gets stopped carrying a vacuum cleaner, what's suspicious about that? She's taking it to be repaired, or loaning it to a friend, or dropping it off for a charity. The modifications are good enough that a casual inspection wouldn't reveal the compartment. It would take someone with your specific expertise to spot the alteration. Leonard absorbed this information, feeling overwhelmed by the implications. His simple observation had exposed an actual espionage operation. What happens now? Now we need your help, Cordell said. We can't move against the Morozovs yet. If we arrest them immediately, we'll only catch one small part of the network. We need to identify all the couriers in the chain, find out who the ultimate handlers are, and determine exactly what information has been compromised. To do that, we need to let the operation continue under controlled circumstances. I don't understand what you need from me, Leonard said, though he was beginning to suspect. Pritchard leaned forward. We need you to go back to that house. Mrs. Morozov knows you as a vacuum salesman who helped fix her machine. We want you to develop that relationship, become someone she trusts enough to talk to casually. Maybe she mentions repair shops she uses, or friends who borrow household items, or shopping centers she frequents. Small details that won't seem significant to her but might help us map the courier network. You want me to spy on her, Leonard said flatly. We want you to help your country, Cordell said. You've already made the decision to get involved by coming to us. We're just asking you to see it through. Leonard looked at the photographs spread across the table, images of a woman he had shared coffee and conversation with, who had seemed like nothing more than a housewife adjusting to American life. The revelation of who she really was, what she was part of, made him feel naive and foolish. But beneath that feeling was something else, a sense of duty he hadn't expected to feel. What exactly would I have to do? He asked. Over the next hour, Pritchard and Cordell outlined their plan. Leonard would return to the Morozov house under the pretense of following up on his previous service call, perhaps offering a special discount on a new vacuum cleaner as part of a seasonal promotion. He would be friendly, professional, and gradually become a familiar presence. The FBI would provide him with a small recording device disguised as a pen that he could carry in his shirt pocket to capture any conversations. They would brief him on what kind of information to listen for and how to gently guide conversations toward useful topics without being obvious. This isn't without risk, Cordell warned. If they suspect you're working with us, the consequences could be serious. Soviet intelligence doesn't take exposure lightly, but we'll have agents nearby at all times. And you'll have an emergency contact protocol if you feel threatened. How long would this go on? Leonard asked. As long as it takes to map the network. Could be weeks, could be months. We'll pay you for your time, of course. Consider it contract work for the federal government. Leonard thought about his quiet life, his routine of sales calls and lonely evenings in his apartment. He thought about the men he had served with during World War II, some of whom hadn't come home. He thought about what it meant to be asked to serve again, in a very different kind of war. I'll do it, he said. The training was brief, but intensive. Over the next 3 days, Leonard met with FBI handlers who taught him the basics of intelligence gathering. They showed him how to use the recording pen, how to position himself in a room for optimal audio pickup, how to ask open-ended questions that encouraged people to talk. They taught him counter-surveillance techniques so he could determine if he was being followed, and they gave him codes for emergency situations. Most importantly, they taught him how to stay calm under pressure, how to maintain his cover even when his heart was racing. "You're not playing a character," Pritchard explained during one session. "You're still Leonard Baskin, vacuum salesman. You're just paying closer attention to details than most salesmen would. The best cover is one that's as close to the truth as possible." On a Monday morning in mid-December, Leonard drove back to Maple Drive with his demonstration vacuum and a briefcase full of promotional materials. His recording pen was clipped to his shirt pocket, and 2 FBI surveillance teams were positioned at either end of the street in unmarked cars. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, but his mind churned with scenarios and possibilities. Helen Morozov seemed surprised but not displeased to see him. "Mr. Baskin, I wasn't expecting you. I apologize for dropping by unannounced, Mrs. Morozov. I wanted to follow up on that repair I did a few weeks ago, make sure everything is still working properly. And my company is running a holiday promotion I thought might interest you." He held up a brochure. 40% off any unit, plus free accessories. She hesitated, then smiled. "That's very thoughtful. The vacuum has been working fine since you fixed it. But please come in for a moment. It's cold out there." Over coffee at her kitchen table, Leonard gradually steered the conversation through the techniques the FBI had taught him. He mentioned that he had other customers in the area who had bought the same model of vacuum she owned before the modifications. Did she know any of them? Where did she usually go if she needed service work done? The question seemed natural in the context of his work, and Helen answered without apparent suspicion. She mentioned a repair shop in Silver Spring that a friend had recommended, though she hadn't needed to use it yet. She talked about a women's social club she had recently joined, where several members shared tips about household management. Leonard listened, remembered, and made mental notes of every detail. The visit lasted 30 minutes. As Leonard prepared to leave, Helen surprised him by asking about his work, about how he had gotten into vacuum sales. He told her the truth, that he had needed a job after the war and had discovered he was good at talking to people. The genuine human connection in that moment felt strange given the deception underlying it, but Leonard pushed the discomfort aside. "You're very good at your job," Helen said as she walked him to the door. "Very thorough." "I believe in doing things right," Leonard replied. He reported everything to Pritchard that afternoon in a debriefing at a restaurant 3 miles from the Morozov house. The repair shop in Silver Spring was already on their radar, connected to 2 other suspected couriers. The women's social club was new information, and the FBI would investigate its membership. "You did well," Pritchard said. "Natural, unhurried. That's exactly the approach we need." Over the following weeks, Leonard became a regular presence in Helen Morozov's life, though never frequent enough to seem suspicious. He stopped by to check on the vacuum, brought new promotional materials, and once helped her carry heavy groceries from her car when he happened to be in the neighborhood. Each visit yielded small pieces of information that the FBI assembled into a larger picture of the Courier network. The Women's Social Club turned out to be particularly significant. 3 of its members were wives of men who worked for defense contractors or government agencies. The FBI surveillance revealed that items were frequently passed between these women under the guise of borrowing or lending household goods. Not just vacuum cleaners, but also sewing machines, kitchen appliances, even large decorative items like lamps. Each had been modified to include hidden compartments for microfilm or documents. "They've built an entire distribution network using domesticity as cover," Cordell explained during one briefing. "The women shop together, have coffee together, help each other with household tasks. It's genius in its simplicity. No one looks twice at a housewife borrowing a blender from a friend." Malcolm Morozov remained the primary source of the classified information, but the FBI had identified 2 other men in similar positions who were also compromised. The full scope of the operation was staggering. For at least 3 years, sensitive Pentagon information had been flowing to the Soviets through this network, hidden in everyday household items transported by women who seemed like nothing more than typical American housewives. Leonard's role expanded as the weeks passed. He became trusted enough that Helen sometimes called him for legitimate vacuum repairs or advice. He met her husband Malcolm once, a quiet man who worked long hours and seemed genuinely devoted to his wife. The humanity of the people he was helping to betray troubled Leonard during long, sleepless nights. These weren't monsters or caricatures from propaganda films. They were people who had made choices, perhaps for ideological reasons or perhaps because they were coerced. But people nonetheless. "Don't let yourself sympathize too much," Pritchard warned him during one difficult conversation. "What they're doing is treason. The information they've passed has likely cost American lives and damaged our national security." Helen Morozov might be pleasant over coffee, but she's part of something that hurts this country. Leonard knew that was true, but the knowing didn't make it easier. He had entered this believing it would be straightforward, a matter of patriots versus traitors. Reality was proving more complicated. The break in the case came in February of 1960. One of the other women in the social club, a woman named Patricia Drummond, was observed making an unscheduled trip to a warehouse district in Baltimore. FBI agents followed her to a building that surveillance had previously connected to a known Soviet intelligence officer named Viktor Petrov. Petrov was a second secretary at the Soviet embassy, a diplomatic position that was commonly used as cover for intelligence operatives. "This is it," Cordell said during an emergency briefing that evening. "We've traced the network from Malcolm Morozov through the Courier chain to a confirmed Soviet handler. We have enough to make arrests." "When?" Leonard asked. "Soon, within the week, most likely. We're coordinating with the State Department and the CIA to ensure we handle the diplomatic aspects properly. Petrov has immunity, so we can't arrest him, but we can declare him persona non grata and force him to leave the country. The couriers and the sources will be arrested simultaneously to prevent anyone from fleeing or destroying evidence." Leonard felt relief mixed with an unexpected sadness. He had lived with this secret for months now, playing his role in an operation that existed in the shadows. Returning to his normal life of vacuum sales would feel anticlimactic and strange. "What happens to me after the arrests?" he asked. "You'll be debriefed thoroughly, and then you're free to go back to your regular life. Your name won't appear in any public documents related to the case, as far as anyone will know. The FBI developed their leads through routine counterintelligence work. You'll be a footnote in a classified file. I suppose that's for the best," Leonard said, though part of him wondered what it would be like to have his contribution recognized, to be seen as something more than just a vacuum salesman who got lucky. The arrests happened on a Tuesday morning in early March. Leonard was on his usual sales route when FBI agents simultaneously raided the homes of Malcolm and Helen Morozov, Patricia Drummond, and 3 other couriers, and the repair shop in Silver Spring that served as a hub for the network. 47 classified documents were recovered, along with microfilm containing hundreds more that had already been passed. The evidence was overwhelming. Leonard learned the details during his final debriefing with Pritchard and Cordell. The Morozovs had both been recruited before leaving Czechoslovakia, trained by Soviet intelligence, and inserted into America as part of a long-term operation. Malcolm's employment at Hartwell Defense Systems had been the goal all along. Years of careful positioning to get him access to valuable information. "Malcolm Morozov isn't even his real name," Pritchard said. "His real identity is still classified, but he's been working for Soviet intelligence since the late 1940s. Helen was his controller, the one who managed the courier network and maintained contact with handlers." "What will happen to them?" Leonard asked. "Federal prison, most likely for the rest of their lives. Treason during wartime carries the death penalty, but we're not technically at war with the Soviet Union, despite the Cold War rhetoric. They'll be tried, convicted, and imprisoned. The others will face similar fates, though some of the peripheral couriers might receive lighter sentences in exchange for cooperation." "And the information they passed, how much damage was done?" Cordell's expression was grim. "We're still assessing that. Some of the documents dealt with weapons systems, others with strategic military planning. The good news is that because we caught them relatively early in the operation, we can work backward and determine exactly what was compromised. That allows us to change plans, move assets, and mitigate the damage. If they had gone undetected for another few years, the consequences could have been catastrophic." Leonard left the FBI building for the last time that afternoon. He carried with him a letter of commendation from the director himself, though he was told the letter would remain classified for at least 25 years. There would be no public recognition, no medal ceremony, no acknowledgement of what he had done. He was just Leonard Baskin, vacuum salesman, walking out into a cold March wind to resume his ordinary life. But something had changed inside him. He drove through the familiar streets of Northern Virginia, seeing everything differently. Behind the neat facades of suburban homes, lives were lived in complexity and moral ambiguity. The woman buying groceries might be exactly what she appeared, or she might be part of something hidden and dangerous. The man washing his car in the driveway might be a loyal American or a foreign agent. Leonard had glimpsed the shadow world that existed beneath the surface of everyday life, and he could never quite forget that glimpse. He continued working his sales route, knocking on doors and demonstrating vacuum cleaners. He became better at his job, his commissions increasing as he applied some of the observation skills the FBI had taught him. He could read people more accurately now, understand their motivations and concerns. His sales pitch became more effective because he truly saw the people he was talking to, not just as potential customers but as complex individuals with hidden depths. Months passed, then years. The Morozov case appeared briefly in newspapers as one of several Cold War espionage trials, but without the dramatic headlines of some other cases. The public's attention moved on quickly to other concerns, other threats. Leonard followed the trial from a distance, reading the sanitized accounts in the Washington Post and knowing how much more complicated the truth had been. He never spoke about his role in the case. When friends or customers mentioned the trial, he offered non-committal observations and changed the subject. The secret sat inside him like a smooth stone, polished by the years. Sometimes he wondered if he had made the right choice in getting involved, whether the consequences for the people arrested justified his actions. But then he would remember the classified documents, the stolen secrets, the damage to national security, and he would reassure himself that he had done his duty. In 1965, Leonard was promoted to regional sales manager, overseeing a team of other vacuum salesmen across 3 states. He was good at training new employees, teaching them not just sales techniques, but how to observe and understand the people they met. He never explained exactly where he had learned these skills, maintaining his quiet competence without drawing attention to its source. He married in 1967, a widow named Barbara who worked as a librarian and appreciated his calm, methodical nature. He told her about his role in the Morozov case one evening, years into their marriage, the words spilling out after too much wine at dinner. She listened without interrupting, then held his hand and said, "You did what you thought was right. That's all anyone can do." The simplicity of her response comforted him more than any elaborate moral justification could have. He had done what he thought was right, in a situation where the right path was far from clear. He had used his particular skills and knowledge to serve his country in an unusual way. Whether history would judge his actions as heroic or simply necessary didn't matter. He had been there, had made his choice, and had lived with the consequences. Leonard Baskin retired from Superior Home Products in 1978 after 32 years in the vacuum sales business. At his retirement party, his colleagues presented him with a gold watch and speeches about his contributions to the company. No one mentioned espionage or Soviet couriers or the case that had briefly pulled him into the shadows of the Cold War. As far as his colleagues knew, he had been nothing more than an exceptional salesman who understood his product better than anyone else. In his retirement, Leonard took up woodworking and spent his days building furniture in his garage workshop. He and Barbara traveled, visiting national parks and historical sites across America. They had a quiet life, comfortable and unremarkable. But sometimes, when Leonard read news about espionage cases or Cold War history, he would remember that November afternoon in 1959 when he had noticed a missing screw on a vacuum cleaner. Such a small detail, barely worth noticing, a tiny flaw in an otherwise perfect operation. But that small detail had been enough, had been the crack that allowed an entire network to be exposed and dismantled. Leonard thought about the randomness of it all, how his particular expertise had intersected with that particular moment to create consequences far beyond what anyone could have predicted. He thought about Helen Morozov sometimes, wondered what prison life was like for her, whether she regretted her choices. He had learned through occasional conversations with Pritchard, who remained a friend over the years, that she had never cooperated with investigators, had maintained her loyalty to the Soviet cause even after her arrest. Malcolm had been the same way, both of them facing decades of imprisonment without ever expressing remorse or providing additional information beyond what the FBI had already discovered. "True believers," Pritchard had said. "They're the hardest kind of agent to flip. They actually believe in what they're doing, think they're on the right side of history. Makes them dangerous but also predictable in some ways." Leonard understood that kind of conviction, even if he didn't share it. He had his own beliefs, his own sense of duty and country. The difference was that his convictions had led him to expose the Morozovs rather than protect them. Two sides of the same coin, perhaps, just facing different directions. In 1985, the classified status on the Morozov case was partially lifted. More details were released to the public, including the ingenious method of using modified household appliances to transport documents. Leonard read the declassified files with interest, seeing the official account of events he had lived through. His name appeared nowhere in the documents, exactly as promised. He was simply described as a civilian informant whose attention to detail proved crucial in breaking the case. That description amused him. Civilian informant. It made him sound more important than he was, or perhaps less important than he had been. He had been a man with a specific skill who happened to be in the right place at the right time, with the courage or perhaps the foolishness to act on what he observed. Nothing more complicated than that, really. Barbara passed away in 1992 after a brief illness. Leonard grieved deeply, having grown to love her quiet strength and patient understanding. In her memory, he established a small scholarship fund at the local community college for students studying library science. It was a modest legacy, funded by careful savings from a lifetime of steady work. Leonard Baskin died in 2003, at the age of 86. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his long career in sales, his marriage to Barbara, his passion for woodworking. There was no mention of espionage or the FBI, or a missing screw on a vacuum cleaner. His story remained classified, known only to a handful of people who had worked on the case or had been briefed on it for official purposes. But in the files of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Leonard Baskin's contribution was recorded and preserved. His observation had led to the exposure of a Soviet courier network that had been operating undetected for years. The classified documents he had helped recover included plans for advanced radar systems, tactical nuclear weapons deployment strategies, and strategic military communications protocols. The damage already done was significant, but the damage prevented by shutting down the network was incalculable. Historians of the Cold War would occasionally come across the Morozov case in their research, noting it as an example of the cat-and-mouse game between American and Soviet intelligence services during the height of nuclear tensions. They would marvel at the creativity of using household appliances as transport methods, at the careful construction of a courier network that operated in plain sight. But they would never know the name of the vacuum salesman who had noticed what no one else had noticed, who had trusted his instincts and taken a risk that most people would have avoided. That anonymity was probably how Leonard would have wanted it. He had never been someone who sought recognition or fame. He had been a man who did his job well, who paid attention to details, who understood that small things often mattered more than large gestures. A missing screw on a vacuum cleaner had been a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone else. But Leonard Baskin had noticed, and he had acted, and history had changed in ways both visible and invisible. Years after Leonard's death, a researcher working on a comprehensive history of Cold War counterintelligence would finally piece together Leonard's identity from multiple sources. The researcher would try to interview people who had known him, hoping to add personal details to the dry facts of the case file. But most of those people had also died by then, and the few who remained remembered only a quiet, competent man who had sold vacuum cleaners and built furniture in his retirement. The researcher would eventually write a paragraph about Leonard in a book that would be read by a few hundred people interested in intelligence history. The paragraph would note that an anonymous civilian informant had played a crucial role in breaking the case, that his expertise with household appliances had allowed him to recognize modifications that trained investigators might have missed. It was a small recognition, but it was something. And perhaps that was appropriate, because Leonard Baskin's story was never about grand heroism or dramatic confrontations. It was about observation, about trusting instincts, about doing what seemed right, even when the path forward was unclear. It was about understanding that important things often hide in plain sight, concealed not by elaborate deceptions but by the simple assumption that ordinary objects are exactly what they appear to be. A vacuum cleaner is just a vacuum cleaner, until someone with the right knowledge looks closely enough to see that it's something more. A housewife is just a housewife, until careful observation reveals the tradecraft of a trained courier. A vacuum salesman is just a salesman, until circumstances demand that he become something else, however briefly, however quietly. Leonard Baskin had been all of these things, ordinary and extraordinary, depending on the angle of observation. He had lived a life that looked unremarkable from the outside, but contained depths that few people ever glimpsed. And in that sense, his story was like the vacuum cleaner that had started everything, a common object with a hidden compartment that changed everything once it was discovered. The missing screw had been the key, the tiny flaw that exposed a much larger secret. But Leonard had been the one with the knowledge and courage to investigate that flaw, to look closer when others would have looked away. That combination of expertise, observation, and moral courage had made the difference between an espionage network continuing to operate and one being shut down. In the end, that was Leonard Baskin's legacy. Not fame or recognition, not medals or public acknowledgement, but the quiet knowledge that he had done something important when it mattered. He had served his country in an unusual way, using the skills of his ordinary profession to achieve something extraordinary. And then he had returned to that ordinary life, carrying his secret with the same unassuming competence he brought to everything else. The vacuum cleaner, long since entered into evidence and stored in a federal warehouse, would eventually be destroyed according to bureaucratic procedure. The microfilm it had contained was catalogued and archived, the information it held incorporated into the historical record of Cold War espionage. The people who had used it for their secret purposes were dead or imprisoned, their network dismantled and their operation exposed. But somewhere in the classified files of American intelligence history, Leonard Baskin's observation remained noted and preserved, a testament to the idea that attention to detail matters, that small things can have large consequences, and that ordinary people sometimes find themselves in extraordinary situations that demand uncommon courage. His story was one of thousands like it, quiet contributions to national security that would never be publicly celebrated, but that shaped the course of the Cold War in countless small ways. And that, perhaps, was the real lesson of Leonard Baskin and the missing screw. History is made not just by the famous and powerful, but by ordinary people who notice what others miss, who act when others hesitate, who trust their instincts even when doing so requires courage and risk. The vacuum salesman who changed history did so not because he was special, but because he brought his full attention and expertise to a moment that required exactly those qualities. In a world of grand narratives and dramatic headlines, Leonard Baskin's story was a reminder that significance often wears ordinary clothes, that heroism sometimes looks like nothing more than doing your job well and trusting what you know. A missing screw, a hidden compartment, a call to the FBI. These were the simple elements that combined to expose a Soviet espionage network and protect American national security during one of the most dangerous periods in modern history. Leonard had been the right person in the right place at the right time, with the right skills and the right character to act on what he observed. That combination of circumstances and qualities had been enough to make a difference, to change outcomes, to matter. And in the final analysis, mattering was perhaps all that any of us could hope for, to be present when needed and to respond with competence and courage to whatever challenges arise. The story of Leonard Baskin and the vacuum cleaner would remain mostly forgotten, a footnote in classified files and a paragraph in obscure histories. But for those who knew the full details, it stood as a testament to the power of observation, the importance of expertise, and the quiet courage of ordinary Americans during extraordinary times. It was a story without dramatic confrontations or spectacular revelations, but it was no less important for its understated nature. Sometimes history turns on a missing screw, noticed by someone who knew enough to understand what that small absence meant. And sometimes the people who change history are vacuum salesmen who do their job well, trust their instincts, and have the courage to act when action is required. Leonard Baskin had been that person, and though the world would never know his name, his contribution had mattered in ways both tangible and immeasurable. That was enough. It had to be enough. And for Leonard Baskin, who had lived his life with quiet competence and understated dignity, it had been enough. He had noticed what others missed, acted when others would have hesitated, and served when service was required. The missing screw had been the beginning, but Leonard's choice to investigate it had been what truly mattered. That choice, made in a moment of curiosity and duty, had changed everything. And in the end, that was the story. Not of spies and counterintelligence operations, not of classified documents and Soviet handlers, but of a man who paid attention, who cared enough to look closely, who had the knowledge to understand what he was seeing and the courage to act on that understanding. Leonard Baskin, vacuum salesman, ordinary American, quiet hero of a war fought in shadows. His legacy lived on not in monuments or history books, but in the security he had helped protect and the duty he had fulfilled when circumstances demanded it. But the full story of Leonard's involvement in the Morozov case contained details that even the classified files didn't fully capture, moments of doubt and fear that he carried with him for the rest of his life. There had been a night in late January of 1960, about 6 weeks into his work as an FBI informant, when everything nearly fell apart. Leonard had been visiting the Morozov house on what should have been a routine call, dropping off some promotional materials for a new vacuum attachment. Helen had invited him in, as had become customary, and they were discussing the merits of different cleaning solutions when Malcolm Morozov arrived home unexpectedly early from work. Leonard had met Malcolm only briefly before, but this encounter was different. Malcolm's eyes held a sharpness that Leonard hadn't noticed previously, an alertness that seemed to take in every detail of Leonard's presence in his home. "Mr. Baskin, isn't it?" Malcolm said, his voice carrying an edge that his wife's never did. "The vacuum salesman. Helen has mentioned you several times." "That's right, sir. Just dropping off some information about our new attachments. Your wife has been kind enough to let me demonstrate our products." Leonard kept his voice steady, professional, aware of the recording pen in his pocket capturing every word. Malcolm moved through the living room with deliberate slowness, removing his coat and hanging it carefully in the closet. "You certainly are attentive to your customers." "More attentive than most salesmen, I think." The words could have been a compliment, but the tone suggested something else. An undercurrent of suspicion that made Leonard's pulse quicken. "I believe in customer service, sir. Building relationships, not just making sales." "Relationships," Malcolm repeated as if tasting the word. He turned to Helen. speaking to her in what Leonard recognized as Czech, rapid sentences that he couldn't understand. Helen responded in the same language, her voice defensive. The conversation lasted perhaps 30 seconds before Malcolm switched back to English. "My wife tells me you've been very helpful, that you even repaired her vacuum free of charge. It was a minor adjustment, nothing that required payment." Malcolm studied Leonard for a long moment, and in that silence, Leonard felt certain that his cover was blown, that somehow this quiet man with the government job had seen through the pretense. He calculated the distance to the door, remembered the panic code Pritchard had taught him, a specific phrase he could work into conversation that would bring the surveillance team running. Then Malcolm smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, we appreciate good service. Perhaps you can show me this new attachment you mentioned. I'm interested in technical improvements." The next 20 minutes were among the most tense of Leonard's life. He demonstrated the vacuum attachment while Malcolm asked detailed questions about its mechanics, questions that went far beyond normal consumer curiosity. Leonard answered carefully, aware that he was being tested in some way, that Malcolm was probing for something without revealing what that something was. When Leonard finally left the Morozov house that evening, his shirt was damp with sweat despite the winter cold. He drove 3 blocks before pulling over, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The surveillance team contacted him within minutes through the radio system they'd installed in his car. "We caught that interaction," Pritchard's voice came through the speaker. "You handled it well. Malcolm was definitely suspicious, but you didn't give him anything concrete to work with." "Did he make me?" Leonard asked, his voice tight. "Hard to say. He's trained to be paranoid, comes with the territory. But if he really thought you were FBI, he wouldn't have let you leave so easily. More likely he's just being cautious, wondering if you're exactly what you appear to be." "Should I stop going there?" There was a pause before Pritchard answered. "We'll discuss it with Cordell. But Leonard, if you want out, now's the time to say so." This was always voluntary. Leonard sat in his car, engine idling, watching his breath fog in the cold air. He thought about the stakes, about the classified documents flowing to Soviet handlers, about the abstract concept of national security, made concrete in modified vacuum cleaners and suburban housewives who were really trained couriers. He thought about the danger he was courting, the risk that Malcolm Morozov's suspicions might solidify into certainty. "I'm not out," he said finally, "but I want to be more careful going forward." "Agreed. We'll scale back your visits. Make them less frequent. Give Malcolm time to relax, to convince himself he was being paranoid." That night had marked a turning point in Leonard's involvement. The work became more real to him, the danger more tangible. He began noticing cars that seemed to follow him, though the FBI assured him these were either their own surveillance teams or his imagination working overtime. He started checking his apartment for signs of intrusion, looking for disturbances in the careful arrangement of his belongings that might indicate someone had been searching while he was out. The paranoia was exhausting, but it was also clarifying. Leonard realized that he had stepped into a world where trust was currency and everyone wore masks. The FBI agents who ran him might be friendly and professional, but they were using him for their purposes. The Morozovs might seem like ordinary people trying to make a life in America, but they were actively working against the country that had given them refuge. Even his fellow vacuum salesmen, his competitors and colleagues, suddenly seemed like potential threats or assets, people who might be exactly what they appeared or might be something else entirely. In early February, Leonard attended a vacuum sales convention in Philadelphia. It was an annual event he normally looked forward to, a chance to see new products and network with other salesmen. But this year, everything felt different. He found himself analyzing conversations, looking for hidden meanings, wondering if the friendly regional manager from Connecticut was actually another FBI informant, or perhaps even a Soviet intelligence officer. At a cocktail party on the second night of the convention, Leonard struck up a conversation with a salesman named Frank Delacroix who worked the Boston territory. Frank was gregarious and well-traveled, with stories about customers in every New England state. As they talked, something about Frank's questions began to bother Leonard. Frank seemed particularly interested in Leonard's Virginia territory, in the types of customers he encountered, in whether he ever dealt with government workers or military families. The questions could have been innocent professional curiosity, but Leonard's heightened awareness made him suspicious. He deflected carefully, keeping his answers vague, and excused himself as soon as he could do so politely. In his hotel room, he called Pritchard using the emergency contact number he'd been given. "I might be imagining things," Leonard said after explaining the encounter, "but it felt wrong. Too many specific questions about my territory and customer base." Pritchard promised to look into Frank Delacroix. 2 days later, he called Leonard with the results. "Frank Delacroix is clean as far as we can tell. Been selling vacuums in Boston for 12 years. Married with 3 kids. No red flags in his background. But your instincts aren't wrong to be alert. The Soviets know we're onto them, even if they don't know exactly how much we know. They're probing, trying to identify potential weak points in their operation. So Frank was just being friendly? Probably, or maybe he's naturally curious. The point is, you're learning to think like an intelligence officer. That's good, it keeps you safe. But thinking like an intelligence officer came with costs that Leonard hadn't anticipated. He found himself unable to relax even during his downtime, constantly analyzing and assessing. His sleep suffered, plagued by dreams where he was trapped in houses with hidden compartments, chased through suburban streets by people whose faces he couldn't quite see. He lost weight, his suits hanging looser on his frame. His sales performance suffered too. The distraction of his secret work made it harder to focus on his legitimate job, and his commission checks reflected the decline. By March, his regional supervisor called him in for a meeting to discuss his numbers. "Leonard, you've always been one of our top performers," the supervisor said, spreading sales reports across his desk. "But the last 4 months have been rough. Is everything okay? Problems at home?" Leonard crafted a story about health issues, about being run down and planning to take better care of himself. The supervisor accepted this explanation with sympathy and suggestions for vitamins and rest. Leonard left the meeting feeling the weight of his double life, the way the secret work was corroding his ability to maintain his cover as a normal vacuum salesman. That evening, he met with Pritchard and Cordell at a safe house in Bethesda. He laid out his concerns bluntly. "This is affecting my real job. If my sales keep declining, I might get fired. And if I get fired, I lose my cover for approaching these houses." Cordell nodded thoughtfully. "We anticipated this might happen. The Bureau can supplement your income to make up for the lost commissions. We'll funnel it through a dummy corporation so it looks like freelance consulting work on your taxes." "That's not the point," Leonard said, surprising himself with his vehemence. "I take pride in my work. I'm good at what I do. Having to choose between doing my job well and helping you is eating at me." Pritchard and Cordell exchanged glances. "We're close to wrapping this up," Pritchard said. "Another few weeks, maybe a month. We've identified most of the network, mapped the courier routes, documented the information flow. Once we have a few more pieces in place, we'll make the arrests. And then what happens to me? You go back to your regular life. You focus on your sales, rebuild your numbers, and this all becomes a memory." But Leonard knew it wouldn't be that simple. The things he had learned, the way he had been changed by this experience, couldn't be erased once the arrests were made. He would carry this with him, the knowledge that ordinary life was never quite as ordinary as it appeared, that danger and deception lurked in places that seemed safe and mundane. The final phase of the operation moved quickly once the FBI decided to act. In the week before the arrests, Leonard made one last visit to the Morozov house. Helen seemed distracted when she answered the door, less welcoming than usual. She let him in but kept checking her watch, clearly expecting him to leave quickly. "Is this a bad time?" Leonard asked. "I can come back another day." "No, it's fine. I just have an appointment later." She stood, rather than inviting him to sit, her body language communicating that this visit would be brief. Leonard went through the motions of discussing a new vacuum model, but his attention was on Helen's unusual nervousness. Something had changed, some new pressure or concern that he couldn't identify. He wondered if the network had been warned somehow, if they suspected surveillance and were preparing to shut down or flee. When he left 15 minutes later, he immediately reported Helen's behavior to the surveillance team. Pritchard called him an hour later with grim news. "We're moving up the timeline. The arrests happen tomorrow morning. If they're getting nervous, we can't risk them destroying evidence or running." "Tomorrow? That's fast." "It has to be. We'll execute simultaneous raids at 6 a.m. before anyone has a chance to react or warn the others. Your part in this is done, Leonard. Stay home tomorrow. Stay away from your normal routes. Once the arrests are made, we'll need you for one final debriefing, and then you're clear." That night, Leonard barely slept. He lay in his bed watching shadows shift across the ceiling, thinking about Helen Morozov, about the coffee they'd shared and the conversations they'd had. She had been kind to him, in her way. She had trusted him, or at least had come to see him as a harmless fixture in her routine. And he had betrayed that trust, used her kindness to gather intelligence that would send her to prison for the rest of her life. The moral complexity of it gnawed at him. He believed in what he had done, believed that stopping the flow of classified information to the Soviets was the right thing. But that belief didn't eliminate the human cost, the fact that his actions would destroy lives. Helen and Malcolm Morozov would lose everything: their freedom, their future, their assumed identities, and carefully constructed lives. The other couriers in the network faced the same fate. He thought about the sliding scale of guilt and innocence, about whether Helen had been coerced into this life or had chosen it willingly. He thought about the classified documents and what damage they might have caused if they had continued flowing to Soviet handlers. He thought about duty and country and the murky ethics of espionage. By the time dawn broke on the morning of the arrests, Leonard had found no easy answers. He made coffee and turned on the radio, waiting for news that didn't come. The FBI wouldn't announce the arrests immediately, he knew. There would be processing and interrogation first, careful documentation of evidence before any public statement was made. The call came at 10:30 a.m. Pritchard's voice was tight with controlled excitement. "We got them all. Clean arrests, no violence, significant evidence recovered. Malcolm tried to destroy some microfilm, but we stopped him in time. Helen didn't resist at all, just asked for a lawyer and refused to say anything else." "How did she seem?" Leonard asked, not sure why it mattered to him. "Calm, resigned almost, like she'd been expecting this for a while." Pritchard paused. "You did good work, Leonard. This is a significant blow to Soviet intelligence operations in the D.C. area." Leonard thanked him and hung up. He sat at his kitchen table with his coffee growing cold, feeling empty rather than triumphant. It was done. The operation he had been part of for months was complete. The arrests made, the network dismantled. He should have felt pride or relief or satisfaction. Instead, he felt tired, drained of emotion, aware only that his life had been irrevocably changed by a missing screw on a vacuum cleaner. In the days following the arrests, Leonard gave his final debriefing to the FBI. They went through everything methodically, every visit to the Morozov house, every conversation, every detail he had observed. His recordings were transcribed and entered into evidence. His written reports were reviewed and filed. By the end of the week, the FBI was satisfied they had extracted every useful piece of information Leonard possessed. Cordell shook his hand at their final meeting. "You rendered a valuable service to your country, Mr. Baskin. That contribution won't be forgotten, even if it can't be publicly acknowledged." "What will happen to them?" Leonard asked. "The Morozovs and the others." "Trial. Most likely within the year. The evidence is overwhelming, so it will probably be quick. They'll be offered deals if they cooperate and provide information about their recruitment and training, but based on what we've seen so far, they won't take those deals. True believers rarely do." Leonard nodded slowly. "And my part in all this stays classified?" "For at least 25 years per standard protocols. After that, it depends on various factors. But yes, your identity will be protected." Leonard returned to his regular sales route the following Monday. He knocked on doors, demonstrated vacuum cleaners, made his pitches with renewed focus. His commissions began to climb back toward their previous levels as he channeled his nervous energy into his work. But everything felt different now, colored by what he knew about the hidden layers beneath suburban normalcy. He found himself paying attention to details he would have previously ignored, noticing things about his customers and their homes that sparked questions in his mind. A photograph showing someone in a military uniform from an unfamiliar country. A bookshelf containing an unusual number of technical manuals. A woman who spoke English with perfect grammar but occasionally used odd idioms that suggested translation from another language. Most of these observations meant nothing, just the quirks of diverse individuals living their lives. But Leonard couldn't turn off the heightened awareness that his FBI training had instilled. He saw potential secrets everywhere, even as he recognized that this was probably paranoia, the after effect of his intense months working as an informant. Pritchard checked in with him periodically over the following months. Casual phone calls that were ostensibly about tying up loose ends but were really wellness checks, making sure Leonard was adjusting back to normal life. During one of these calls in late summer, Pritchard shared an update on the case. "The trial is scheduled for October. All defendants are pleading not guilty, which is expected. The evidence is solid enough that the outcome isn't really in doubt, but they're going to make us prove every detail." "Will I have to testify?" Leonard asked, feeling a spike of anxiety at the thought of facing Helen Morozov in a courtroom. "No. Your identity is protected, and your contribution can be presented through FBI testimony without revealing the source. You won't have to appear." Leonard felt relief, mixed with an unexpected pang of regret. Part of him wanted to be there, to see the conclusion of the thing he had helped to start. But another part, the larger part, was grateful to remain anonymous, to avoid the confrontation that courtroom testimony would represent. The trial, when it happened, was reported in newspapers but without the sensational coverage that some other espionage cases had received. The details about modified household appliances created some interest, with reporters marveling at the creativity of the Courier method. But compared to the atomic spy cases of the previous decade, the Morozov network seemed almost mundane, Just another example of Cold War espionage. Leonard followed the coverage closely, reading every article he could find. The newspaper accounts were sanitized and simplified, missing the nuance and complexity of the actual operation. They portrayed the defendants as clear villains and the FBI as unambiguous heroes, when Leonard's experience had shown him that reality was messier, more morally complicated. All defendants were convicted in November of 1960. Malcolm and Helen Morozov received 30-year sentences. The other couriers got varying terms based on their level of involvement and the classified material they had handled. Viktor Petrov, the Soviet handler, had already been expelled from the country months earlier, safely back in Moscow beyond American justice. Leonard thought about those sentences, about 30 years in federal prison for espionage. Malcolm and Helen would be in their 60s when they were released, their lives essentially over, consumed by their service to a cause that might not even survive that long. The Berlin Wall was going up that year, the Cold War escalating, and Leonard wondered if either side would ultimately prove to have been worth the sacrifices people like the Morozovs had made for it. These philosophical questions occupied his mind during long drives between sales calls. He had conversations with himself that he could never have with anyone else, working through the ethics of what he had done, trying to reconcile his belief in his actions with his unease about their consequences. The certainty he had felt in Agent Cordell's office when he first agreed to help had eroded into something more complex, a recognition that even righteous actions could carry moral weight. As the years passed and Leonard moved forward with his life, the intensity of these thoughts gradually faded. The Morozov case became something that had happened to him, rather than something that defined him. He could go days or even weeks without thinking about it, absorbed in the ordinary concerns of work and eventually marriage and domestic life. But certain things would always trigger the memories. Seeing a vacuum cleaner similar to the one Helen Morozov had owned, reading news about espionage cases or Soviet infiltration, hearing someone speak with a Czech accent. These moments would transport Leonard back to that November afternoon in 1959 when he had first noticed the missing screw, and he would remember how a tiny detail had changed the course of his life. He wondered sometimes what would have happened if he hadn't noticed, if his eye hadn't been trained to spot modifications and alterations. The Morozov network would have continued operating, passing classified documents through their ingenious household appliance method. How much longer would they have gone undetected? What additional damage would have been done to American national security? There was no way to know, but Leonard took quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that his observation had mattered, that his decision to report it had prevented harm even if that harm remained abstract and unmeasurable. In his later years after Barbara's death, Leonard would occasionally take out the classified letter of commendation he had received from the FBI director. He would read it in his workshop, surrounded by the furniture he had built with his own hands, reflecting on the strangeness of having been part of something significant that he could never discuss openly. The letter was physical proof that it had all really happened, that he hadn't imagined his brief career as an intelligence informant. He thought about writing down his experiences, creating a memoir that could be published after his death and the declassification of the relevant files. He even started several times, filling notebooks with recollections and reflections. But he could never quite capture what the experience had really been like. The mixture of fear and duty and moral complexity. The written words felt flat compared to the lived reality, and eventually he stopped trying to record it. Perhaps some things resisted being captured in language, existing only in memory and feeling. Leonard's experience with the Morozov case was like that. Something he carried inside him that defied complete articulation. It had taught him about the hidden depths beneath surface appearances, about the courage required to act on uncertain knowledge, about the moral ambiguity that characterized so much of human life.